Bismillah. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa usalli wa usallimu ala man bu'itha rahmatan lil alameen. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to a resumption of the Ummatics Colloquium. We were on hiatus over the summer period while there was a conference, Alhamdulillah, a very successful conference in Istanbul. And it gives us great pleasure to welcome you all to a discussion with Professor Jonathan Brown, Dr. Jimmy Jones, and Dr. Muhammad Khalifa, who will be engaging Professor Brown's book, Islam and Blackness. I should say his latest book. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome you this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, as the case may be, because I expect people are zooming in from various parts of the world, to a discussion of Jonathan Brown's book, Islam and Blackness. Jack, if you'll forgive me, I'll address you by your first name when I'm addressing you, but I should say Professor Jonathan Brown needs no introduction, being from Georgetown University and having at this point published half a dozen books on various aspects of Islam and Islamic civilization. His latest book, Islam and Blackness, explores the important subject of anti-blackness, subjects of anti-blackness, slavery, and racism in Islamic history and theology. This work is significant for the purposes of the Ummatics Colloquium because it engages critically with the accusation that Islam is inherently anti-black or promotes slavery. The latter shibboleth is one that Professor Brown has powerfully addressed in his last book, Slavery in Islam. I don't know how you managed to write such sort of densely researched books in such short periods of time, but you remain an inspiration. Jazakumullah khairan. So in the present work, Professor Brown argues convincingly that while anti-blackness and slavery have existed in Islamic civilization, and in the case of anti-blackness, unfortunately continues to exist, they are not intrinsic to Islam's founding principles and scriptures. He shows how the Quran and Hadith promote racial equality between peoples, condemning both tribalism and racism. This may be seen in the Prophet's Muhammad's normative practice, according to which he showed esteem towards his companions regardless of their skin color and castigated those who would denigrate others because of their darker skin. However, Professor Brown also acknowledges that anti-black attitudes did take hold over time due to the influence of inherited cultural biases and social prejudices towards outsiders that associated blackness with slavery. You gave an interesting anecdote just now that, this takes a long time and kind of becomes established in recent centuries. So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but even as late as the 15th century, an Englishman could be enslaved because he was not observing sort of certain legal interdictions that, led to that. So ultimately, ultimately, Professor Brown concludes that Islamic intellectual history contains some human shortcomings that must be rejected, but also powerful foundational principles of human dignity that form its cornerstone. For Ummatics and for the Ummatics Institute, this book highlights the need for modern Islamic thought to reclaim Islam's egalitarian ethical teachings in order to combat enduring problems of racism. The path forward is not to reject the Islamic heritage wholesale, but to reorient that heritage towards the Quran and Sunnah's vision of justice and human unity. I look forward to, inshallah, a fruitful discussion in partnership with Professors Jimmy Jones and Muhammad Khalifa to think about how, in an ummatic spirit, we can promote anti-racism and mutual understanding between different peoples as a kind of means of realizing the Quran's and Sunnah's conception of an ummah. So with that, I wish to hand it over to you, Jack. You will have, if that's okay, 20 to 30 minutes to give a broad overview of what you are arguing, inshallah, connecting that to the question of ummatics and what it means to think about this as an ummatic problematic, pardon that expression. And then that will be followed by Professor Jimmy Jones speaking, responding to your remarks for about 10 to 15 minutes, if that's okay, followed by Professor Muhammad Khalifa responding to your remarks for roughly the same time. And then you'll have the opportunity to respond to those before we open the floor to any people who have comments. Audience members, attendees, if you wish to comment, please put your hand up and they will be noted down by us and will come to you around the hour. And without further ado, I should also mention, of course, that we had a third discussant, Dr. Haditha Kere Abdurrahman. She's recently just traveled back from Nigeria and she's been a bit unwell. So unfortunately, she gives her sincere apologies for not being able to join. But inshallah, we will do the best with what we have. And I'm sure Professor Brown, Dr. Jones and Dr. Khalifa will give us a scintillating 2 hours. And finally, I suppose I should mention that I thank Professor Brown for making the time, despite the fact that he has a flight to catch. So we will conclude exactly in 1 hour and 40 minutes.
I have a flight to catch to see Jimmy Jones. So Jimmy Jones' comments better be, I don't know, I'm pretty sure that he can beat me in a fight. So I'm not going to he can pretty much say whatever he wants. Yeah, this is the book I was talking about, Freedom's Debt by Pettigrew. You can see the title there if you want. Yeah, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for adjusting the time for my incompetent scheduling. Thanks to the panelists for coming and taking their time to at least think about the book, maybe even read it. Who knows? I'm not sure if I would something if I were a panelist. I can't tell. So I mean, the first thing I should say is why, people would say, why did you write this book? And that's a fair question. I am not Black, as you may be able to tell from my existence. But the reason why is because there was, well, first of all, in some ways, it's a continuation of my previous book on Islam and slavery, because there was this one part of the book that, it was a story that I actually had as an appendix in the book that was really, in some ways, very inspirational, but in some ways very confusing. Just a very short version. There's this, it's a story of a saint in Basra in the 700s. And basically, all the scholars of the city realized that the real friend of God, the real saint in the city is this Black slave. We don't know his name. He's just a Black slave. He's like the one who really is. So they free him, they buy him, they free him, and they basically say, we're going to be your students. And long story short, the saint dies while he's praying, and they turn him over. And as they turn him over and they realize he's dead, the story says the blackness vanished from his face and his face became like the moon. So on the one hand, you have this story, which is really inspirational, in that all these, Arab, or almost all of them were Arab at this point, or, free Muslim scholars, the leading lights of the city of Basra, basically subordinate themselves to the person who's really the lowest person on the social ladder, this Black slave, because they realize he has the knowledge and piety that they want, right? So that's, in that one sense, that's very inspirational. On the other hand, you have the idea that Blackness is something that disappears. You see the person's goodness. So Blackness is something that's sort of bad and to be wished away. So I was really confused by this story, but I didn't really do anything about it. I mean, I just sort of thought, well, that's interesting. Maybe I'll find out about that someday. But the more immediate cause for writing the book was that I think it was the summer of 2020. Could it have been that long ago? Wow. It was the summer whenever COVID happened. I can't remember when that was, but there was this debate, which I guess is actually, I didn't know about it, but it's an ongoing debate. It has been going on for some time, where it's not just it's a popular debate, but it's actually also some academics hold this position that Islam is anti-Black. Not just Muslims are racist, but Islam at the level of its scripture, of the Quran, the Sunnah, the Sharia is actually anti-Black. So this was being debated, and on this one listserv, and I kept getting sent questions about this debate. This hadith says this. How do you answer this question? So I sort of tried to look into this, and one thing led to another. In order to answer one question, I had to answer another question. I had to look at context, et cetera, et cetera. And before I knew it, I was, I had this big project, and it turned into a book. Now, I should say that there are other books that deal with this, very good books. Abdul Hamid Ali's, I think, The Negro and the Arab Islamic Consciousness. There's Sherman Jackson's book. There's Abdul Haq Ashanti's Defining Legends, I think it's called. There's a number of books that are excellent. And Dawood Walid has, I think, 2 books. Ahmed Mubarak has a book. And Mustafa Briggs has a new book, Beyond Bilal. So these are all very good books, and I read them and used them, but they did not address the specific issues that were being raised, or some of the issues that were raised in this debate, and they didn't deal with some of the bigger contextual issues. So what I tried to do with this book was to kind of bring together the best stuff that had been written on this topic so far, add, fill in the gaps that hadn't been addressed, and then kind of add more contextualizing information. And so that's how the book came about. So the main, I guess, the kind of I should start out by saying one of the things I address in the book, which I found to be very interesting, is why this debate happens. Like, so why is it that we talk about Islam being anti-Black? Like, why is this? I mean, just the other day, there was this article, I think, in The Spectator in the UK about, why don't we talk about Islamic slavery? And then just as often you'll see, like, why don't we talk about, racism in the Arab world? Or why don't we talk about Arab anti-Blackness, right? So this, considering that, we in this discussion is kind of people in the West who are generally not Muslim and not related to Islamic civilization, we actually do talk a lot about Islamic slavery, quote unquote, and about anti-Blackness in the Arab Muslim world, considering that's not like immediately relevant to us in the West. But so the question is, why is that? Like, how did this become an issue? How is this being debated in academic listservs, or how is this something that comes up regularly even in the public square about the kind of anti-Blackness of the Arab world or the Muslim world? So I trace this back to three roots. The first is that the general Western European, especially British and American and Irish, experience of what some people call the Barbary slave trade, or the Barbary captivity, which is that from really the 1500s till the early 1700s, there are Muslim pirates basically operating off out of what's today Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, who are actually like raiding and capturing British and American and Italian and French sailors at sea or ships, and taking people captive, bringing them back to their bases as slaves, where there generally would be ransom back to their families, right? So that was basically a money-making system. So this becomes a big part of kind of feature in Western European cultural imagination. People write stories about their. One guy, by the way, who was a captive was John Smith, the founder, one of the guys at Jamestown, which my kids just learned about last year in school. And a number, I think also Daniel Defoe might have been, or the character in Robinson Crusoe. I can't remember which one. And there's like a lot of stories written about my time in the Barbary captivity, and so the horrors of how I was treated, and the Moors, and their like the swarthy Moors, and then their Negro slaves that they put in charge of us white Christians. And then you start having like it's such a big genre that it's sort of best-selling books in French and English and in the American colonies, to the point that people start writing fake ones, like forged ones. They become fictionalized, and it actually keeps going long after. By the time you get into the mid 1700s, this is not really an issue anymore, right? Because things like the Royal Navy are very powerful. European navies are much more powerful. And at that point, it's actually a lot of times Muslims being captured by European vessels operating out of places like Livorno in Italy and other places, and being sold as slaves in Italy and France. So even though that like the tables had turned, there's still this genre of the idea of the Muslim slaver capturing us. And of course, there's a lot of anxiety here, right? Because not only is the white person being captured by the Muslim, the swarthy Muslim, with his even swarthier African slave, but the big fear is like the white woman being captured and then being lured in / violated / attracted to this swarthy, you can kind of put a bunch of stereotypes in there. Muslim, Moorish male. And then, so this becomes actually, there's novels written about this, there's board games written about this, all the way into like the mid 20th century, even in films, right? So some of the earliest films that are made in Hollywood are actually about this issue. So things like Tarzan, everyone knows the Tarzan story. Why is Tarzan in Africa? Why is his family there? We'll talk about that in a second. But there's this this genre of movies called the Sheikh genre, which is about white man, white woman, or white man or white woman being captured by Arab slavers, and then either escaping or fighting or falling in love with them, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of you could have really some psychoanalysis, cultural psychoanalysis of these stories, because there's this. Is this like a rated R or PG, or what is this rated, this colloquium?
I would encourage you to use your discretion.
I don't have discretion, so I'm just going to say there's an obsession with fear of being sodomized by Muslim men, which I don't know. I'm just going to put it out there. It's really like obsessive in these stories, to the point that like Muslims will hear about this and they'll be like, "Where are you getting this stuff from? Like, we're not. This is against our religion." They're like, "No, we're obsessed." So anyway, and this goes all the way up into things like Midnight Express, like movies about Turkish prisons and things like that. So so that's the first source, is this anxiety about the Muslim slaver enslaving us. The second thing is that after the kind of abolitionist activists in Britain and the UK and the US or the Americas succeed in ending the Atlantic slave trade in the essentially early 1800s, their attention turns to what they see as the only other slave trade. So they say there's basically two slave trades. They say there's the kind of the slave trade that we did, which is sometimes called Christian slave trade, but it's not really Christian because it's not the Christian thing to do. We ended that. The only other thing is what they call the Mohammedan slave trade. So that becomes the main kind of focus of abolitionist energy after the 1830s, especially. And here you have this clear idea emerged that the only source of slavery in the kind of the world as they know it, kind of the Afro-Eurasian world, are basically Muslims. So it's especially Muslims, evil Arab Muslims capturing, wonderful, innocent, noble, savage, native Africans who just want to dance and frolic and things like that, right? So then you start having the image of the white kind of hunter or explorer or colonist coming in and saving the Black African victims from the evil foreign Muslim / Arab slavers, right? And that's becomes a big cultural theme as well. As I mentioned, that's actually behind the whole Tarzan series, is that Tarzan's family has gone to Africa to protect the African population against Arab slavers. So this becomes a huge issue. And then that gets picked up by, so that's the kind of the first source, is the kind of Barbary captivity, and then the idea of the Muslim slave trade, Muslims enslaving Africans. The second one is that this becomes very attractive to certain Black nationalist movements in the U.S. Black nationalist movements are movements like late 19th, early 20th century, like the Moorish Science Temple, or like the back to Abyssinia movement, Marcus Garvey's movement, of course, Nation of Islam, right? The idea that Africans, descendants of African slaves in America start to identify with a kind of real or mythical, usually mythical or imagined African past and African present that they really belong to. So it's with the case of the Nation of Islam, it's sort of like a North African, but still Black, North African, Arabian, Black identity, Muslim identity. In the case of what emerges as some of these other Black nationalist movements, like the Kemet Afrocentrist movement, they identify much more with like sub-Saharan African identities like Yoruba and especially like Yoruba and Nigeria, different Nigerian identities. And they start seeing, so what they do is they adopt this idea of the Arab Muslim slaver, and they like kind of Christians in America, white Christians in America, see the Muslims and the Arabs as an enemy, and that they were a colonizing force that was kind of enslaving and threatening and destroying African civilization. You can see this with books like the book that came out in the 1970s, Destruction of African Civilization by Chancellor Williams. And of course, you see the cover of the book. It's basically this, kind of Black African kind of, I guess, sort of tribal warrior. You're wearing a kind of skirt of some kind. He's got a shield. You sort of imagine like any random ethnicity you could imagine, right? And with like a spear and a shield, and he's defending against this stereotypical Arab Muslim who's got like a turban on, and he's like, with a scimitar, and he's on a horse hacking down on this guy. So that's like, for this notion of Afrocentrism, Muslims in Islam are totally foreign to Africa, and they're an invasive colonial presence. And you can see also why this is sort of blends well with an American context, because it removes the focus of blame from white European and Americans and puts it on Arabs/Muslims. So people like Chancellor William Henrik Clarkson, one of his successors, will say that the Muslim Arab slave trade and colonial presence in Africa was worse than the European slave trade, right? So that kind of discourse you can see is being very blending well with kind of conservative European and American ideas that the West is best, and like our past is not a past of sin, and that we we did slavery, but we were sorry for it, whereas these Muslims, they did it worse than us, and they've never apologized, right? So that's the second source is kind of Afrocentrist ideas in the U.S. And by the way, that's interesting because some of that's actually gone back to Africa, right? So especially in like Nigerian politics, you have some of these ideas of American Afrocentrism coming back and growing in and spreading amongst especially Christian Nigerian politicians who will start talking about Muslims as foreigners, Muslims as invaders, as oppressors of the kind of the real, true Africa. If you want to read about this, you can read the books like Wole Soyinka, the famous Nigerian fiction writer who also wrote some nonfiction. He's a really big kind of articulator of kind of Afrocentrism, and talks about how Islam and Arabs can never really be part of Africa. Okay, then the third source is actually it's just Zionist Hasbara, basically pro-Israel public diplomacy. And I know someone would say, "Oh my God, how can you say that? That's like anti-Semitic." And no, this is just very obvious. There's no debate about this. So the like people who are engaged in pro-Israel public diplomacy from the 1960s onward very clearly articulate that they have interest in stoking this idea of Arabs/Muslims being anti-Black and slavers, because what it does is, one, it fragments the kind of third world or colonized world solidarity against Western forces or settler colonialism. because it says to, you know, sub-Saharan Africans, your real enemy is not the white man, it's Arabs and Muslims. They're your real enemy. And second, it says that, you know, we Zionists are not actually racist. It's actually the Arabs who are really racist, because look at all their anti-Black racism. So if you look at, I think I said this on Twitter like 2 days ago or something, but if you look at who writes these articles about why don't we talk about Arab Islamic slavery? Arab Islamic slavery is worse than European slavery. Why don't we talk about Arab Islamic blackness? Why don't we talk about these always come from two sources. It's American and sort of European, American, and British, usually West is best conservatives. And it's pro-Israel media outfits. The only two sources. They will consistently, like clockwork, write about this topic. Like, what's the name of the Mark Lamont Hill, for example, when he would, anytime he'll write about solidarity with Palestinians, you'll immediately see either in Israeli online news outlets or just kind of pro-Israel or Israeli pundits will come out and say, how can you say this, Mark Lamont Hill, when Palestinians, the word for Black in Palestinian Arabic is abd, is slave, right? So they'll immediately start to try to stoke the fires of, or draw attention to, and inflate the notion of kind of Muslim Arab anti-Black racism. So I should say that, you know, just as a rebuttal to this idea of Arab Islamic slavery, and I drew on other people who've done much better work on this than I have. I mean, who actually worked on it. People like Dalu Gubara and Nathaniel Matthews. If you want, especially Nathaniel Matthews' article is online. You can read it. It's very accessible. But they both make this argument, which is, look, if you want to talk about like Arab Islamic slavery or Arab slavery or Islamic slavery in Africa, this is absolutely fraught with problems from the beginning. First of all, what is Islamic slavery? Is Islamic slavery just slavery that Muslims do? So anytime, like, let's say I'm a Christian and I'm enslaving people, and then I suddenly convert to Islam and I'm enslaving people. Is this now Islamic slavery? Second of all, this idea that Arabs or Muslims are not part of Africa is nonsense, because you have, you know, hundreds of millions of Africa, you know, people that we would racialize as Black, who see themselves as Black, are Muslims, and there's millions of people in Africa who speak Arabic, right? And who learn to read and write Arabic. And of course, there's also this, which of course is ignored by 19th century abolitionists, but there's this enormous internal to Africa slave trade that's not done by Muslims, right? So at the same time as abolitionists are talking about the evils of the Mohammedan slave trade, they're non-Muslim, you know, either Christian or people following traditional African religions in places like what's today Nigeria, who are engaged in their own slave trade, who are actually enslaving people, buying slaves, selling slaves. And of course, there's also Ethiopia in the 19th century and early 20th century, a Christian kingdom that is also engaged in expansion and conquest and enslavement of people. So there's all these, inaccuracies that stem from stereotypes about what Islam is, about what Arabs are, about what Africa is, and these are all highly inaccurate. So it turns out I only have like 8 minutes left, which is amazing that I could talk this much. But so that's one of the things I talk about in the book. The rest of the book is speaking about a couple of things. One thing I found really interesting was actually just studying how we have conceptions of Blackness. Like, where does this, I mean, this is a really interesting question. Who came up with the idea of saying that people are Black or white or whatever, right? So, I mean, I've never met someone who actually has actual Black skin. I've never met someone who actually has white skin. I mean, so these ideas of how color naming comes up are really interesting. And then how people depict themselves in pictures, how that has to do with the availability of paint and ink and colors, like what people, how our conceptions of color and race are linked to just things like what object do we have that we can name our color after, or how do we make paints and how can we represent ourselves? That was really interesting. Then I talked about anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism in Islamic civilization. I show how the kind of Arabic culture at the time of the Prophet and the Arabian Peninsula, when you do see kind of people speaking about Blackness negatively, it's not because there's anything inherently wrong with Blackness. It's because in that case, Blackness is seen as a marker of being an outsider in that tribal society. And so, for example, we'll often hear about Bilal being Black, but we don't hear about Amr bin al-As or Safwan bin Umayyah or other huge Quraysh figures in the Quraysh, Muslims and non-Muslims. We don't hear about them being Black, which they are. They're described as being Black because their mothers are African. We never hear about that because it's irrelevant. They're part of the tribal elite, so they're not going to be criticized. The Blackness is brought up only when you want to point out the outsider status of someone like Bilal. I then talk about, for example, Bilal has trouble getting married. He's an outsider. You know who has double the amount of difficulty getting married, according to reports, if you just look at the number of stories, is actually Salman al-Farisi, who is the opposite of Black. I mean, he's probably lighter skinned than a lot of the Arabs because he's also an outsider. So it's being an outsider that's difficult. And if you're Black and an outsider, then the Blackness will be brought up as your issue. If you're Persian and an outsider, then it's your Persian ancestry that's brought up as an issue. Then I show how this is fairly well known that, then Islamic civilization, as Muslims spread out into the greater Mediterranean Near Eastern world, they inherit a lot of the racial stereotypes, not just from Greco-Roman culture, but also from the biblical tradition. And I show that in the case of Islamic civilization, in Islamic law, in Sufism and theology and things like that, when there is anti-Blackness, which there definitely is, it's I think incidental. It's not essentialist, right? So it's nothing about. There are people who, although a lot of Muslims will talk about the reason, the idea of the curse of Ham, which they inherit from the Greco-Roman and the biblical tradition, but that Black people are Black because they were cursed to have black skin and to be enslaved because one of Noah's sons didn't behave properly towards his father, and that son's descendants are then cursed with Blackness and enslavement. But there's as often, or I should say as often, but there are very, very senior, huge figures in the Islamic scholarly tradition, like Ibn al-Jawzi, Suyuti, Ibn Khaldun, others, who just completely reject this notion of the curse of Ham. They say it goes against the hadith we know about, the origins of how people actually have their skin colors. That goes against their scientific ideas. So there's always voices that speak out against this. And these are very senior, these aren't marginal voices. These are some of the most prominent Muslim scholars in history. And then I show that when you have things like in Islamic law, where you have, for example, in Maliki law, mentions that, Black women are not attractive, or they don't have to wear hijab or something because they're not attractive and you can look at them. I show how this is just expressions of custom in that area, and that in that Maliki school of law, other Maliki scholars will say, listen, you might have this idea of what's attractive or not, but that's not how we think of attractiveness. And why are you implanting your kind of customary notions of what's beautiful, not beautiful in a fiqh book? This isn't appropriate for other people who don't have these customs. And I show how in Mecca from like the 1500s to at least the 1900s, there's this obsession that Ethiopian or women from the Horn of Africa, sort of Ethiopia and Somalia, are considered the most beautiful women and kind of the most prized partners. So I discuss this and more in the book, but I don't want to go on forever. So I'll leave it there.
Jack, for really giving a fascinating overview of a very varied sort of kaleidoscope of discussions that are found in your book. Of course, I mean, right towards the beginning of it, you highlight that anti-Blackness is, in terms of Islamic civilization, is incidental, not essential, and it should not be attributed to the Quran and the Sunnah. And there are various, partly geopolitical reasons for that maneuver. At this point, I want to take the opportunity to welcome Professor Jimmy Jones to present 10 to 15 minutes of sort of comment. I, inshallah, also encourage people to write in questions in the Q&A box, and we will try and address them once we have the discussants put in their comments. Just a brief sort of introduction to Professor Jimmy Jones. He's a senior fellow at the Yaqeen Institute and a member of the American Academy of Religion, and an emeritus professor at Manhattanville College. He received his doctorate from Yale Divinity, master's degree from Yale Divinity School, and his doctorate from Hartford Seminary. So without further ado, Professor Jones, after you.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I want to say that this book is a book that I like because, first of all, I'm a bibliophile. I've been a bibliophile since I was reading library books in segregated Roanoke, Virginia, a long, long time ago, over 60 years ago. I just love books. That's number one. Number two, as an educator, I think this book, whether you like the book or not, because there are people who before Professor Brown even released the book were saying, how dare you, right? And this is terrible for somebody white to be doing this thing. It's the kind of book that I like because it's intellectually provocative and intellectually inclusive, which are intertwined. What do I mean by that? I mean, I would argue that being intellectually provocative is part of the prophetic tradition of Islam. In other words, that our beloved prophet, peace be upon him, was often taught by being intellectually provocative. Many of you know better than I the story about the young man who wanted to commit illegal sexual intercourse, and the prophet asking him, peace be upon him, would he like to do it with his mother and other relatives? This is being intellectually provocative. See, for me, and like I'm at the Islamic Seminary of America these days, what we do in the classroom, both in my courses and other courses, particularly Yasakani, is to be intellectually provocative in the service of learning, in the service of understanding. And I think this book does an excellent job of that. And being provocative, in my view, pedagogically speaking, is one of the things that, particularly at the graduate school level and also at the undergraduate level, that we as professors should definitely be about. And because I think being provocative invites people in to the discussion rather than you just walking in and say, this is what's going on. And I think part of my role and part of the role of a professor is to make sure that people who are at the margins for whatever reasons, when I was at Manhattanville College, I often taught about race and gender, and few white males took my course. But I saw as my role to include, make sure that there were parts of the discourse in the classroom that they could relate to, maybe not like, but also get involved in. And so that's number one. I think this book, and people who know me know that I sometimes like books more than I like people for various reasons. I won't get into that. And so the second thing is that the question is, well, how can a white guy named Brown, write this book? Well, because I want to start back with the whole notion of Islam and religion. There's a book by Rosemary Radford Ruether called Sexism and God Talk. And in the first part of the book, she makes a very persuasive argument that all revelation is mediated through human experience. That's to say, and this was an eye-opener for me, because this really says that even though we get wahi for us as Muslims, the reality is that our beloved Prophet was a human being, and we won't get into the issue of whether he's perfect or not, but was a human being in a human context, and therefore subject to the cultural context of those particular people at that particular time. And that I would argue to both the Christians and the Muslims in my classroom, is that you don't really understand Christianity. You don't really understand Islam unless you have some ability to delve in the primary language. Obviously for Muslims we should, but I would say to the Christians, I mean, I was raised in a Christian context, and I read the King James Version of the Bible, and I thought Jesus Christ spoke like King James. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. I would argue we don't really understand unless we understand that all revelation is mediated through human experience. Therefore, to really argue that anti-Blackness in 1445 or 2023 and anti-Blackness 1400 years ago is essentially the same thing, which many people do, quite frankly. It's just intellectually lazy. There's no way around it. And it leads us to places that absolutely don't make any sense at all. And I think Professor Brown has done this very, very well using language, using history in his book in terms of unpacking the reality that lots of things have happened in the last 1400 years, and to label Islam, in essence, anti-Black, it just doesn't make any sense at all. I think the other way that this book is helpful is the appendices, which help us delve into the various ideas, paradigms about Islam and anti-Blackness, depending on what you're interested in. And I just love that in the book. And then there's the bibliography. The bibliography, I love bibliographies because the bibliographies lead me to more readings. I would ask Professor Brown to think about, I thought some things were noticeably missing from the bibliography from my perspective as a person who teaches about racism a lot still at the Islamic Seminary of America. One is Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I think that that a lot of our thinking, including within and outside of the Muslim community, but particularly in academia, is being framed that way, and it makes a nice target for people like the governor down in Florida because of what I call the lazy intellectual thinking behind this major premise. That is to say, you're either racist or anti-racist. And the way I look at social justice and the way I look at intellectual development, it just doesn't make any sense. When I'm organizing, and I've been a community organizer, in the community, I want to get those people in the middle between the two, right? Because those people often are the people who move us ahead. And so I thought that Kendi's book was missing. The other thing is that a book that I use often is Gordon Allport's older book written by a white male, Gordon Allport, The Nature of Prejudice, simply because I think it gives us a place to start, and Professor Brown talks about this at the end of the book, gives us a place to start in terms of dealing with some of the impact of racism, anti-Blackness on a personal level. And Professor Brown talks about a concept introduced by somebody else called the duty to miscegenate. I mean, I love this term, the duty to miscegenate. I think it's one of those intellectually provocative terms. I grew up in the state of Virginia where miscegenation was against the law up until the 1960s when it was overturned by the United States Supreme Court in a case entitled Loving versus Virginia. And that's, at this time I grew up in Virginia, miscegenation was a thing, in that you could get locked up, and the Lovings, I believe, might have been put in jail at one time, but others were, for interracial marriage. And so, the duty to miscegenate, and Professor Brown doesn't buy it at all. He argues that we should at least think about, giving a fair chance to people from other cultures, and particularly talking about Black people, which I think is a good idea. But I think what Gordon Allport does in this book, in the first couple of chapters, talks about the 5 levels of acting out prejudice, and the lowest level being anti-locution, that is speaking bad about a group of people. I think one of the things that we can do to combat anti-Blackness, combat prejudice, is to monitor our speech, which is nothing strange to us as Muslims, as we well know. And as we understand that, we should make sure that, and if you can look at this book, because my time is running out here. But anyway, it's 5 levels of acting out prejudice. Starts with anti-locution, then it moves to avoidance, then it moves to segregation and to extinction, and they're interlocked. That is, Allport argues that negative talk about individuals leads to avoidance, leads to discrimination, leads to attack, leads to things like the Holocaust. And I buy this argument. And so we should guard our tongues when we talk, more so than we do in the Muslim community, about anti-Blackness and the like. The final thing I want to say is to say there's something called racial allegiance. That in the African American community in particular, I believe that we put up with people whose belief about Islam and Allah are very, very far afield of what the average Muslim worldwide, right, would accept in terms of that. And I won't unpack that at all. The only reason that we oftentimes do this is because of racial allegiance. And what I mean by this is that many of us who have, quote, done well and studied Islam and Arabic and done very well at it, still cling to people and notions that are from the street, right? And I think this is very problematical in terms of moving this project of Islam forward in the United States, and B, being seen as Muslims, the way Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him, was seen as a leader of the Muslim project, as it will. And Bilal certainly was a leader of the Muslim project in the early Muslim community. And I think this sort of racial allegiance that many, I believe, African Americans have pushes us to the back. I want to disagree. I want to close by disagreeing with Professor Brown on his story about the Bajran monk. I just read that differently. It might be difference, had to do with the difference in my racial background. I don't read it that the monk who was Black and turned white. For me, I read it in the Quranic context, maybe. And secondly, I was a bit amazed because this is at the beginning of the book. And then Professor Brown goes to a great deal of very good research, spanning centuries, spanning different contexts, Chinese and other, to unpack this notion that somehow Blackness means bad and whiteness means good, because it's not all the time in all contexts. And I think in that particular context, I think he misreads it. There's a kind of racial allegiance that I think white people have to Black people in contexts like that, where they're often Blacker than we are. I have a mentee who was like that, who I have to caution him about being so hard on white people. And really, the final point I will say is that the notion of being the wrong phenotype, right? In this case, Professor Brown is the wrong person to be writing about Blackness, which it's an outrageous concept. I have many examples of this, but I want you to think about intellectual provocative people like Imam Siraj Wahaj, Sister Aisha Prime, Ubaidullah Evans, and my favorite person to debate with, Sherman Jackson, who phenotypically are constantly in spaces where they're talking about things that Black bodies aren't used to talking about. And so somehow it's okay for them, but not okay for Jonathan Brown. Why don't I stop there?
Jazakumullah khairan, Professor Jones. Really sort of some very thought-provoking comments, and I'm sure it will spin into a very engaging discussion. Professor Brown, you'll have the opportunity, inshallah, to share your reflections just after we give the floor to Professor Muhammad Khalifa. Dr. Muhammad Khalifa, very brief introduction for you. He's a professor in the Department of Educational Studies at Ohio State University. I just want to give you 10 to 15 minutes. Please feel free to share your thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Azami. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulil Kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I have nothing but praise for the book too. I loved reading it. I think it's a great contribution. And just to kind of just jump right off and get it out of the way about whether or not Dr. Jonathan Brown, as a person who's socialized to take your language, as a white man, can write this book. I just challenge folks to respect scholarship for what it is, and to think that African Americans such as myself, probably we would have never reached a state of being not slaves if it were not for white abolitionists and other white Americans who, alongside Black Americans, fought for, the freedom of whites. So I would just like to get that out of the way quickly. That doesn't mean that people don't carry biases into their writing. That doesn't mean that people don't carry other, questions into their writing. So I just to get that out of the way quickly. Now I do want to address whiteness a little bit in my remarks just in a minute, but I'll try to keep my remarks short. I was really, really happy to kind of just go through this journey with Professor Brown about, I really enjoyed the first part of the book too, as he kind of theorized through different types of Blackness, what it means, anti-Blackness and the such, and then brought that into histories of Islam and how anti-Blackness rose through Islam. And one of the things that I've first thought about before reading the book was the Hadith of the Raisin and what anti-Blackness meant at the advent of the Prophet. When the Prophet came, I mean, there were clearly some, maybe there are narrations out there I'm not aware of things like follow your leader even if he's a Roman slave, or follow your leader even if he's a Persian slave or something like that. But I haven't seen those narratives, so I do of course not attribute any type of bigotry to the Prophet. And this entire book, I think, did a great job of laying that out. However, he was perhaps speaking to, as the Prophet ﷺ himself described Jahiliyyah in his people, that he was trying to cleanse them of that. And as we know, after the Prophet left, all types of Jahiliyyah came back. One of the questions, so I was just left with a number of questions, and I think that the questions, kind of come into three broad areas. So I'll just go through them really quickly. When I was reading the book, I was really blown away at the level of detail. But I was also wondering why should we as Muslims have to apologize for example, out of behaviors, or no fiqhi or no jurist can ever come and leave his biases at the courtroom or masjid. So why should we have to defend those? I think that perhaps some of them are not. I mean, I really appreciated the nuance in the culture and the hierarchies that need to be protected in order for societies to be harmonious. But I also felt that perhaps by us trying to defend that, perhaps we have some culpability in that a little bit. Let me just get to, so one broad area is anti-Blackness and the entanglement with whiteness. And so scholars like Ralph Ellison and other scholars in the modern era all kind of suggest that Blackness, especially post-colonial, like after the colonization of European conquest and imperialism, that Blackness has a deep entanglement with whiteness. And that, for example, Black identities were sacrificed in order to complete white identity. So in other words, white identities could not be described, or Europe as a continent could not have been enriched, or in this same kind of like, you know, both discursive and material behavior comes up in anti-Blackness, but it's impossible from a colonial way, since colonization and colonial way forward, to kind of describe, and especially in the current moment, Blackness without having a almost deeply intertwined white type of whiteness with that. And I was wondering if there might be more space in the book to kind of take up whiteness. There were some aspects in which it did come out here and there. And so, you know, this, like, for example, the Afro-pessimist, you know, views that you talked about, which I thought was fascinating. But so in other words, in order to be human is to not be Black, right? And I think it's very correct that many Afro-pessimists would say, like, you know, okay, these solidarities, because we're talking about solidarity here. And I think that that's a valid point. You know, I think that many Afro-pessimists feel like, you know, the solidarities are there. And this is, of course, how African-American Muslims that I know and have spoken with definitely have a sense of this too, that, you know, hold on a second, we've gone out for Palestine, we've gone out for Kashmir, we've gone out for Burma, we've gone out for all of these. And the moment you kind of like get this, the famine is lifted or the war, then okay, those solidarities are no longer there. I guess the question around that is, are African-American Muslims and other Muslims in other Western countries, and there's a lot of distinction. A good friend of mine too is Dr. Jackson. He and I talked about how African-Americans here are distinct. We're not seen as immigrant origin and stuff like that. But it is some sort of subtractive or dehumanized view of Black American Muslims also needed in the Muslim community in the current moment. There are also questions, another category around epistemologies, and so a lot of attention both in the current Muslim community and in the book was given to the treatment of people and how they may be positioned. There was some attention to materiality, but it was mainly about kind of this interaction between Blacks and Arabs or Blacks and other Muslims or Blacks and Europeans. And I'm wondering, although this is definitely important, I did wonder to what extent are Black epistemologies or Black ways of being, a Black knowledge that, for example, gave birth to places like Timbuktu, but other just Black ways of being might be taken up in such a work, or how does this work speak to that? In other words, when people show up in a space and their cultural patterns are not recognized or not normalized, to what extent is that anti-Blackness as well? Not just the interpersonal, but the historical and the culture and the epistemological. And so we're not necessarily talking about intentional, but we're talking about cultural. So like, for example, so like I'm a scholar of education, and what we would argue in an educational space is that it's not only about the interaction between teacher and student, or principal and student, or principal and parent. It's like, okay, all of this experiential and historical and contextual knowledge that these kids come to school with, is you don't find it in the curriculum, you don't find it in the pedagogies, you don't find it in the instruction. And so to what extent does the knowledge that people contain also, how is that expressed through anti-Blackness is one of the questions. I don't know if that's clear or not. And then the last sort of question I had, or group of questions, kind of are connected to power in the current moment. So like in the contemporary masjid, for example, does recognizing Blackness or not recognize? So like every masjid I go to, it seems as though the expressions of Islam, the announcements, the entire kind of culture around that space is devoid, unless it is an African American or African masjid, but in masajid or in cultural spaces, it seems as though the knowledge and the knowledge production, the stances, the histories heavily reflect anti-Black sentiments. And so, you know, a lot of masajid I go to, for example, they're always talking about Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. May Allah have mercy on them both. And I'm always wondering if Muhammad Ali or Malcolm X were here, would they have even felt comfortable in this space? So it's this exoticization of Black bodies in this space. So I guess I'll end with a couple more thoughts. It seems as though Muslims today, as I'm hearing them talk about race and racism, they de facto kind of go to, okay, there was Bilal, there was Usaama, and there were other Sahabi, and then there's you know, there's the verse that the best of you are those who are closest to Allah, and that's like the de facto response for all of the nuances that Dr. Jonathan Brown is bringing up in this book, and I think that it is true, it's clear. I think it's indisputable that Islam is an egalitarian, and it goes against any type of prejudice or racism or anything like that. I think it's quite clear. I'm wondering what the actions of current scholars should be with this, and it seems to me to be short-sighted, and if to borrow from Professor Jones, intellectually lazy, just to say, hey, there was Bilal, and Allah says that the believers are brothers. And I think that I shouldn't say it's intellectually lazy. Those, I mean, that is our faith, but I don't think that that's been enough to kind of shed light on the nuances there. And I think that maybe it's people putting their head in the sand. I'm not sure. I've been deeply frustrated by it. So, like, for example, a question that I'm having is, you know, Dr. Jackson gave a lecture about white supremacy and kufr. Is anti-Blackness kufr? If people persist, because I've been in many masajid where, mashallah, tabarakallah, the imams are talking about Blackness and they're talking about racism, and it's like the community doesn't shift. Right. You still aren't marrying my daughter. I'm glad that you brought up marriage in the end part of the book. I'm glad, but you still not marrying my daughter. I'm still not going into business with you, and I still will have this distant relationship with you. Like let's just take it up. Is anti-Blackness a type of kufr? And I'm not saying that will take you outside of Islam, but you know, one of the types of kufr. So I'll end there. Jazakumullah khair. May Allah bless you. May Allah bless the work. May Allah allow you to continue to produce such works in defense of Islam, and barakallahu fiqh.
Ameen. Jazakumullah khair. Jazakumullah khair to all three panelists, and I want to say that I'm happy for you to continue to sort of dialogue with each other as we continue the next hour or so, because I think you've addressed a whole host of issues which you may well be interested in hearing the other panelists' views on. So I want to sort of point that out. I also want to say that, you know, Jazakumullah khair for all the attendees. We have a set of questions in the Q&A which we'll start to address. Just before we do that, I'm going to give the floor to Professor Brown in just a second. But I did want to perhaps use my chair's prerogative for a moment and say to Dr. Muhammad Khalifa that your comments about, you know, is anti-Blackness kufr, as in kufr duna kufr, so to speak, like a type of kufr which is, as Ibn Abbas refers to, that can be below kufr. But if we think of the hadith of the Prophet, I think it was the hadith of Abu Dharr where he had, you know, castigated someone and insulted a slave, I think, because of their blackness. That is something that Jack has dealt with in the book. And And the Prophet's response is, Ya Abu Dhar, innaka mru'un fika jahiliya. Oh, Abu Dhar, you're a person who has some jahiliya. And jahiliya is a species of kufr. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, a scholar who wrote about takfir in the last century, commented that this hadith is an indication that iman and kufr can both be present. I mean, iman and jahiliya can be present in someone. Just because there are elements of jahiliya doesn't render the person completely outside the fold of Islam, but that is undoubtedly an element which is antithetical to their Islamic identity. So, but I would love to hear Professor Brown and any Professor Jones' comments as well. So, Professor Brown, you have the floor now to just respond to anything that you've heard so far.
Thanks so much for those comments. And I think that was first time. I want to write down, put on my CV, Professor Jimmy Jones says Jonathan Brown is, quote, blacker than we are. I don't know if that's going to use that as a, so the Bilal, the Hadith of Abu Dhar, people get this confused a lot. The well-known version in Sahih Bukhari is Abu Dhar insults somebody. We don't know what, we just know he insults somebody about their mother. And then the Prophet ﷺ gives him advice about how slaves should be treated. There's a very, very much less well-known version that it's Bilal that Abu Dhar insults. And so the one where he says you have Jahiliyyah in you, he insults someone, but we don't know who that person is. But that's just like a detail. I realized I should have resolved that Basran saint story. I just left it there and didn't give the explanation. So it's very interesting because when we read it, like there is, we have our biases, right? So we say when the blackness leaves him, we think would maybe look like Brad Pitt or something. I'm not sure what he would look like, right? But it's very clear in these stories. These appear in actually a lot of Sufi stories, this idea of the blackness vanishing from a saint's face. But it always says, at least almost always, it says, the blackness vanished and his face became like the moon. So it's not his face became white. It's not his face became Arab. It becomes like the moon. So you have, I have a whole chapter on this, right? In the Sufi tradition, you have this notion of the black slave as the lowest, right? So if the human voyage towards God is a voyage from the material world, from the kind of lowness of our animal nature, higher and higher and higher to we like connect with the transcendent divine, right? So that's, and the boundary of the astral world is the moon. So in the kind of Ptolemaic, Aristotelian, Abyssinian Islamic philosophy, we live in the sublunary world. So the moon is the boundary of the kind of heavens versus our world. And then the moon is also, of course, the Prophet Muhammad. So becoming like the moon is to become beautiful in faith. It's to become transcendent, right? It's to transcend this earthly world and it's the prison and the problems that that we live with and the vices that plague us in this world. So you have the story of the black slave becoming like the moon, the vanishing blackness is about, remember, so Adam, the name Adam means dark, very dark, right? So the human being, the Adam, goes from being black, dark, to being like the moon, like the Prophet Muhammad, transcended. So you have to read these stories through the kind of language of Sufism. Then it makes sense. It's if you just read it kind of from an American perspective or a modern perspective, you see black person turns into white person. So what's up with that? So I think it's very important that we understand how to read these stories in their appropriate context. Then we understand the meaning, as opposed to just kind of reading it only through our lens of suspicion. Okay. Professor Jones talked about anti-racism and Ibram Kendi's book. You know what? I could not get a copy of his book. I couldn't get it from the library. I couldn't get any copy of it. So I listened to a bunch of it as an audiobook, and then I read a bunch of reviews of it. I'm not criticizing the book. It's a fine book, but I think it's represents a school of thought it's not a new idea. I talk about this in one chapter in my book, which I think is actually very useful for people who are interested in this topic, about kind of big debates within discussions about racism, race and racism, because a lot of the, there's a lot of controversy in public life in America about calling people race. White people get upset. Why are you telling me I'm racist just because I'm white? It's because there's two different understandings of race and of racism. Basically, the kind of classical traditional understanding is I'm racist if I say I think that you're bad because of your race, or you're worse than me because of your race, right? So it's about my belief, it's about intention, it's about animosity, it's about what's going on in my head towards you. Whereas what you might call like substantive racial or substantial racism school of thought says racism doesn't matter what you believe. Racism is a system. It's a system that results in inequities based on race. And if you're part of that system, you might think there's no difference between black people and white people. You might love black people. You might whatever. Your best friend might be black, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're part of that system, you are racist because that system is racist. So, and that it has nothing to do with my intention. It has to do with if I'm part of a system. In order to not be racist, I actually have to step out and say, I am actually going to fight against the system and try and dismantle it. So what happens is you'll have someone like Ibram X. Kendi say, you're racist because you're part of the system. And then that white person's like, what do you mean I'm racist? I don't believe black people are bad, but it's because you have two different definitions of racism that are kind of going past each other. And that's why I think people would probably be less combative about this if they understood that there were two different definitions being used. The raisin hadith is fascinating. The hadith is in Sahih Bukhari, where the Prophet says, obey your commander, even if he's a Ethiopian slave whose head looks like a raisin. It's very interesting because that actually is in Sahih Bukhari, but that's a very rare version of that hadith. The main version that you'll see across collections is just the Prophet saying, obey your commander, even if they are a slave, mutilated slave, like a slave who's been cut, like to show their slave status or something. So it actually doesn't mention blackness. So it's interesting because if you took the main version of that hadith, it would actually not contain that raisin clause. But let's forget about that and just look at the raisin clause. What I thought when I was studying this, it's very interesting to look at how Muslim scholars understand this over the centuries. So until roughly the 1200s, and again, we're talking about scholars who are Arab, Persian, Central Asian, they basically say, they just treat it as a description. Like, okay, he's Ethiopian, so his skin is dark like the color of a raisin, and their hair is curly, and it's sort of like the texture of the wrinkled texture of the raisin. So they'll say it's about hair texture and about color. Then after you go through the 1200s, it starts taking a nastier turn. So you start seeing people say their head is like a raisin because they're stupid and they're kind of less intelligent. You have a lot of these like nasty stereotypes coming in, right? But what I found interesting was, and this is weird, right? Let's say scholars in the kind of West African tradition write an enormous amount of work. They write, I mean, for example, praise poetry about the Prophet, just volumes and volumes of this stuff. But they don't seem to write hadith commentaries. So it's very hard to find them talking about this. Although you do see, for example, the Sokoto caliphs, Uthman bin Fodio and his son, Muhammad Bello, who were both very good scholars, they quote this hadith in their own writings, and they don't have any anxiety about it. They don't say like, oh, yeah, I don't know what to say about this. I feel like insulted. They just use it. They don't have any problem with it. Similarly, a scholar who actually is Ethiopian, who died just a few years ago, Muhammad Amin al-Harari, he discusses it, and he's Ethiopian, and he doesn't, again, just sort of pretty matter of fact about the hadith. So I think it's important here to, like, I might be offended, we might be offended by this comparison, but we also have to accept the perspective of, Black Muslim people who we racialize as Black, or Muslims who thought themselves as Black. who would just see this as a comparison, like saying, yeah, someone's, and this is what you see a lot in Islamic thought, and also just pre-modern human, and even kind of up until kind of 1990s political correctness. The idea that I say like, oh, Usaama, your skin looks like, your head looks like, I don't know, like Reese's Pieces. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of some stupid. I mean, like that. Now people are like, oh my God, Jonathan Brown said this. He should be canceled. No, like up until relatively recently, it was just totally normal to say so and so looks like X, right? I mean, this is, and so we can have our sensibilities. That's fine. And if it makes people feel better to not be compared to objects or to food or whatever, that's totally, that's totally laudable, and I support that. But we don't want to take this and like impose it on the past and treat people in the past as somehow having failed to live up to our objective moral standards that are somehow universal. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Whiteness, we Khalifa talked about that as well. Yeah, it's really interesting. So one of the reasons I'm not I'm not like, some people are really into white culture or something. I don't really I don't support the idea of a white identity. I don't support the idea of white culture. I don't like this like rich men north of Richmond nonsense. It's all just Confederate. And far as I'm concerned, this is just Confederacy rhetoric, and it's all like deeply anti-Black racist. It's and I think it's all dressed up. It's just racism dressed up in whatever modern clothes we want to give it. White identity is entirely defined by the oppression and dispossession of other people, like that. I mean, I wish there were things like white food or like white culture, like that I could be down with or something, but there's just not. It's all based on crushing other people and treating them like garbage, in my opinion, or just maybe being alcoholic. I'm not sure. So the point is that I don't support or endorse any kind of positive concept of whiteness. I think it's entirely like a negative concept that's, it exists through negative integration by othering groups. It's interesting to think about like why whiteness is valued at different times throughout, and this is something you find in much of the northern hemisphere, certainly kind of north of Sahara Desert, and all the way to Japan, Europe, or to Japan, and is that in pre-modern period, whiteness is valued in women because it's seen as a sign of elite status, right? Because you don't have to go out and get sunburned. So you often see like whiteness praised and dark skin denigrated. And it's not, but there's actually economic reasons behind that. It's because the darker person is the person who's been out in the sun having to work, whereas the light-skinned woman is the one who's rich and can stay inside. So how whiteness intersects with standards of beauty can change over time. Whereas now whiteness is a standard of beauty, not in the sense of kind of white skin and its economic value, but because today, if you're rich, you can get a tan, right? So if you're a really white person, you would actually, to look rich and successful, you would, look like Donald Trump or something and get a tan. You don't want to look pasty and horrible like me. So whereas now it's about actually European phenotype, like the actual hair and the eyes and the nose of a northern kind of notional European person, that becomes the standard of beauty. Probably because of colonialism and ongoing Western European cultural domination of the cultural sphere. Timbuktu and Black philosophy. I mean, this is there's a lot to write about there, but I'm just not qualified to do that. I read about this. I did my best to read about it and figure out if I could bring it into my work. I didn't feel like it had a lot of intersection. And I think one of the reasons is that sometimes the way in which scholars try to make kind of Blackness and Islam and African philosophy and, Africanness intersect with Islam is actually highly problematic once you look at it, because people talk about Timbuktu. People talk about Ahmed Baba, died 1627. Ahmed Baba was, if you ask Ahmed Baba, what is your identity? Say, I'm a Sinhaja Berber. And there in Timbuktu at the time of Ahmed Baba, there's black and there's white people. So his mosque, the Sankori Mosque, means the white master mosque. It's like the Sayyid al-Abyad, the white master mosque, right? The Sir Whitey, basically. It's like the Sir Honky Mosque, if you will, right? And yet it's he and it and Timbuktu are seen as these representations of Black Islam or Black scholarship. Now, that objection is also wrong, right? Because if we have no idea what Ahmed Baba looked like. If Ahmed Baba came to America, he would probably be considered Black, right? So, and the being Black or white in Timbuktu had nothing to do with how you looked. It had to do with what your ethnicity was. If you're Berber or Arab or Fulani, usually you were considered white, even though you might be extremely dark skinned because you have that ethnic background. It's associated with pastoralism. And if you're Black, it means you come from groups like Wangara. Sorry, let me just silence my phone, which is making and it's associated with a with an agricultural background. So when we go in and we look at Timbuktu and we see black and white, and we see Ahmed Baba and all the things like that, this is just a feast of misunderstanding for us, because one, the black and white has nothing to do with how people looked. Two, it has nothing to do with our understanding of black and white. Three, but it's hard because you don't know, when, for example, if you have a Berber scholar in Timbuktu writing, and they're talking about hadith, and they see a hadith about an Ethiopian slave, and they have a commentary on it, are they going to be seeing that as talking about them, or is about somebody else in the city? Like, it's very hard to know if you're, for example, Mauritanian scholar, or someone from Mali or Senegal, or Fulani scholar, like the Sokoto caliphs were. It's very hard to know how they saw themselves. We don't know, do they even see themselves as black? It's very hard to tell. It's only relatively recently in the 1800s, I think, that you even start seeing people, black scholars, talking about themselves as Sud, as black, as Aswad. Before, they might talk about themselves as like being Hausa, or from Borno, right? Like, it's very hard to know how people view themselves and view other people. And we just go and say, oh, well, they're from Africa, so we're going to treat them like a black scholar or an example of African philosophy or something. And I think that's might be accurate, but it has to be approached with a lot more caution than just saying someone from Timbuktu is African and representing African tradition or something.
Professor Brown, unfortunately, because we're a bit short on time, I wonder if
yeah, I'm done. Okay, so let me just finish one more thing, which is about the contemporary mosques. I mean, I don't want to say like I've been saying this for a long time, but I've been saying this for a long time. Mosques in the U.S. leadership should be ceded to Black Muslim. I think this is an obvious thing to do for the good of our community and for its protection, and for other anti-racist reasons. And I think, yeah, you have a big, I mean, I live in Northern Virginia. You have all these mosques, which are basically all like rich Desis and Arabs. That's great. Nothing wrong with rich Desis and Arabs, right? But there's other mosques in the area which are like black mosques, and these two groups don't interact. And so I think they should do things like mosque partnerships, where these mosques do activities together. I mean, like Muhammad, or Jimmy, like if I come and talk to you, right? We're both Muslims, right? But the difference in our race in America will always be part of our conversation. And even if we're pretending it's not, that pretending is part of the conversation, right? Until we get to the point where we've spent enough time together and our families have spent enough time together that we just don't even think about that anymore. Until we do that, this will remain an issue. And you have to literally force socialization until that consciousness disappears. That's my opinion. Okay, I'm happy to answer questions.
Jazakumullah khairan. Barakallahu feekum. And both Dr. Khalifa, Dr. Jones, inshallah, we're going to turn to questions now, but if you want to put in additional comments, please don't hesitate. And so actually the earliest question is an interesting one. It might be that this is really in your territory, Jack, more than anyone else's. Someone's basically given a link to a Thomson Reuters sort of like scan of a fatwa given by ISIL legitimating, sexual slavery in their territories. So this is, obviously ISIS in recent times, and someone's saying, is this good law, so to speak? So this is probably addressed by your book and your
I tried to look at that. I pressed a link, but I'm like such a bad multitasker. There's no way that I could read that and think about it and pay attention to stuff. So I would just urge the person to read my book on Islam and slavery, which probably someone has made into a PDF, unfortunately. But
right. Okay. The next question has in some sense been answered, but I should also say there will be polls coming up periodically. For anyone who's an attendee, please do have a read of them and try to respond. So over the next few minutes, you might expect to see a few polls coming up, which are pertinent to the subject. Gihad Hassanin, who actually is a doctoral supervisee of mine at Oxford, asks, in response to this point by Dr. Khalifa, it is also interesting to hear all of your thoughts on the extent to which these attitudes by Muslims towards Black people, African Americans, or towards non-Arabs more generally, are themselves influenced by the modern construction of Islam, Arabs, and Black people, and the relations among these categories. Some of it seems inflected entirely through modern discourse and ignorance of Muslim history on the part of Muslims themselves. So yeah, to what extent is the way in which we perceive racism in our own time a function of modern categories of thought?
I don't know. I think there's a lot of answer. I mean, I think that the way that it depends where you are, right? So I think a lot of it depends on where we think of like Islam being, right? So if we think about Islam as being kind of Mediterranean, Arab worldy, then that's certainly a bias. And then kind of there's sort of the new Muslims or the not really Muslims are like the Black Africans and South Asians and Southeast Asians, right? Which is of course nonsense, right? So if you just go by scholarship, probably South Asia has produced more Muslim scholarship in the last 200 years than anywhere else. Similarly, you have tremendous, like this one scholar in the 1300s travels from the Hijaz to Mali, and he's like the scholars here know Maliki law better than I do, and so I think that. But if you see scholars writing, even Egyptians, let's say, writing in the 1800s, their attitudes towards Blackness and Africans are very similar towards white people. And there's also this kind of there's a little bit of patronizing Black Muslims as they're not as knowledgeable as us. Someone who encounters this is Sheikh Ibrahim Niyas, who died in 1975, and he has some writing about this, where he goes to like Egypt and he's speaking in perfect Arabic. They're like, "How do you know Arabic?" He's like, "I'm a Muslim scholar. What do you mean? How do I know Arabic?" Right? I think there is some intersection of modernity, but I think a lot of these issues and these fault lines and tensions have pre-modern origins in Islamic civilization. Allahumma salli Muhammad. Yeah, I don't know if that answers that question. Any other questions? I keep getting these polls.
So these polls, incidentally, I mean, just for what it's worth, we did put out a poll which said, to what extent is racism more generally an issue among modern Muslims? So not just anti-Black racism within the United States, but there are other forms of racism that I think anti-Black racism is probably the most salient globally. But I guess in perhaps attitudes of Arab superiority in certain instances, or maybe South Asian superiority vis-a-vis other groups within the Muslims.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Like, I think, you know, as much as I've been bagging on white people, I think, you know, white, and this is, I probably don't even need to say this, but like, you know, white Americans and Europeans are, if they're racist, they at least know they need to like hide that or like channel it in certain ways, right? Whereas there's other parts of the world, I'm not naming names, where people are just straight up racist, and they're just in ways that are kind of terrifying. I don't want to blame anybody, but there's other parts of the world that where you go and you're just like, you know, you see stuff and I can't believe I just saw this. I can't believe people are actually acting like this, and they don't even think it's a problem. Like, I understand someone acts like this and like everybody's like, oh my God, that's terrible, but no one even thinks it's a problem.
I think there's also an element, if I may, Jack, of the two different definitions of racism that you were talking about, because it's the sort of surface level racism of, you know, rather than the structural form of racism that someone like Du Bois is talking about, that's very often maybe on display and is not shocking to those people in those cultures. But in our own context in the West, I think that sort of deeper structurated kind of civilizational project that is reflective of you know, contemporary racism is more salient.
Awesome.
Yeah.
One person asked about the verses of the Quran that talks about the believers, you know, on the day of judgment, some people's face will be white, some people's face will be black. Okay, very interesting. It's very important to remember that when you look at Arab culture at the time of the Prophet in the kind of Quranic context, if you talk about people's phenotypes, the way they look, you either use a bipartite system, which would be red and black, and there's a debate about whether or not Arabs are red or black, but there's red or black, or tripart system, which is black, white, and red, and white being more of like a kind of Mediterranean-y look. White is sort of a more lighter skinned Mediterranean look. None of this, by the way, involves Northern Europeans who are just off the radar white for these people. Same way with the Romans, by the way. For Romans, that's where the idea of white comes from. People calling people white is a Roman word. Albus means a sort of general just picture like a typical Italian guy. That's white. If someone was a Northern European, like Irish or British or German, Romans would call that person pallidus, which means pallid. So that they didn't even use the word white. Those people were beyond white. So Arabs. So my point is that if you have a black-white comparison in the time of the Prophet, it's actually not about people's looks. It's about noble, ignoble. So that's why someone will say, like, you're white of face, or may God whiten your face. It means God ennoble you, honor you, right? So and Muslim scholars talk about this without exception, basically, when they do the tafsir of these verses. This has nothing to do with how you look, about being African or Arab or whatever, or you're, on the day of judgment, you're going to look like an African person or something. No, this is about nobility, ignobility. And as Fakhr Razi says, blackness is not like any blackness in the world. This is like a completely other discussion. Like, it's not about earthly phenotype. It's not comparable. So it's very important to remember, when you're talking about the Quran, the context of the Quran, black and white is a metaphor about good and bad. Red and black is about looks, or black, red, and white. Those are the ones we're talking about looks.
Forgive me, I had my mic on mute. Once again, Professors Khalifa and Jones, if you want to chime in at any point, please don't hesitate. There was a question about Professor Ben Freeman's work. So
I think Bernard Freeman, you mean?
Yes, Bernard Freeman, sorry. And so does this book serve as a work of Black Islamic theology? I think this is a reference to your book. How does it compare or contrast with the work of Bernard Freeman?
I think, I think Bernard Freeman's book's more about slavery and Islamic civilization. I think maybe Sherman Jackson has books about like Black theology and theology of Black suffering. So I think Sherman Jackson's works, mine doesn't deal with that kind of stuff. Mine's really about concepts of Blackness and Islamic civilization.
Right.
I wouldn't be qualified to write the other kind of book. Someone says, does it also draw on the binary of light and darkness? Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting to think about. Like, why is it that, and this is something that I find fascinating. And if I couldn't believe that I couldn't find a study on this, which is how do people who speak languages in Africa south of Sahara, how do they deal with metaphor and physical descriptor use of black and white, right? So what I did, I did as many surveys as I could, and I did as much research as I could on research done on these languages. And what you find is it's very common in Africa south of Sahara for people to say, for example, what is the normal skin color of someone in your region? They would say black, right? And then they would say, for example, do they have figures of speech like black-hearted or something? And then they'd say, yes, we have this phrase. But there's no association between black as a color descriptor and black as metaphor. They don't see it as as somehow influencing the way they see their skin color. Now you do have, for example, in Fulani dialects, Fulbe dialects, slaves will be talked about as darker than regular people. But it's interesting, in that case, it's not about like the melanin content of their skin. It's about dirt and like the dirtiness, like it's the black of dirt, right? So the notion of black as lesser and white as better, light as better and dark as worse is common even in areas where you have people who are all dark skinned, all would be like racialized as black today, and who even use black to describe their own skin color. But that doesn't mean that they see the word black as a physical descriptor as being necessarily negative. The other thing is, why is that? I mean, it's interesting. But then another thing you find, which is fascinating, is how white is understood to the extent we have access to this material, how pre-colonial sub-Saharan African cultures thought about color. So for example, the Congo region and stuff, you have these masks that are like whitish color, like gray white color. And those are the masks of someone who's dead, like an ancestor or a spirit. So white is thought of as like linked to death and the ancestors, maybe because when people die, like their blood pools in their body and like their face would actually look lighter colored. So it's interesting that there's an association of like whiteness with the afterlife, or like the links with the ancestors. So it's very different than maybe other people might think about whiteness. So this stuff is all fascinating, and I hope people do more research on this.
Just a comment about the first of the polls, which asked, to what extent is racism a more general problem or that modern Muslims need to grapple with? And, understandably, everyone said either it's a central issue that needs addressing or it's an important issue, but not necessarily central. So everyone recognizes, that it is an issue. I think 1 out of 20 people who participated said they thought it was a low priority. So, I mean, in general, there is a recognition that this is actually quite an important issue, throughout the modern Ummah. I wonder if any of the scholars wants to comment on the question of its role in, an ummatic context. If people are thinking as an ummah, or if we want to revive this sense of solidarity across 1.5, nearly 2 billion Muslims, those divisions, ethnic, in our own time, national, linguistic, and racial will be a component of those. To what extent do you think that that's something that needs and even can be surmounted Dr. Khalifa, you mentioned the idea of, look, if you're not going to do business with me, you're going to mention Bilal, but you're not going to do business with me. If you're going to talk about how the Prophet was anti-racist, but you're not going to let your daughter marry my son, for example, how do you overcome that, do you think? And this is a question for everyone, I guess.
Well,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Dr. Jones.
Dr. Jones, I think you.
Yeah, I was step in and say that this is the issue for leadership in the community, and again, it's the way we conceptualize the whole problem is part of the problem, and part of the leadership has an obligation to, I believe, if you're leading in the Muslim community, you have an obligation to understand some of the things we're talking about today, because in the United States of America, Blackness, racist, anti-racist is front and center almost every place that matters, like the presidential candidates talk about it. And so therefore, if you're gonna be a chair of the board, run youth groups, you should understand this. I'm not necessarily talking about teaching this, because I think understanding the fact that Blackness now is very different from Blackness even 50 years ago, and that we understand that you have to come to grips with it if you're going to live in this society, and you have to make some effort to be, I hate to say it like this, pro-human, because that's really what it's about, because that the notion that Black means other than human is a very real thing. It's something that I felt growing up in this country, and that you have to dismantle it. But I don't. I'll stop by. You don't dismantle it by calling people racist, by the way. I just don't, because dismantling it is about starting a conversation that leads to action, and calling people racist doesn't start the conversation.
Usaama, I wrote that thing for you. Is that getting published, or is it getting sent to people, or what happens with that? Because it does deal with like Afro-pessimism and Islamic civilization. I don't know.
Right. So the Professor Brown very kindly has provided sort of a brief summary of some of the key arguments in his book, and that will be published on the Ummatics website. We apologize, we were supposed to send it to the members on the mailing list, but inshallah it'll be on the website.
Yeah, I want to chime in too, because I really do think that Muslims today, as Dr. Jones is saying, I don't think that we have really like a collective language that we're using to address this, and it kind of makes it seem disingenuous a little bit. Ever since like those proto-Islamic Black movements went on the offensive against Christianity being a white man's religion, like 100 years ago, I'm not sure that this book would have been needed. It's deeply needed now. And it's not just the interpersonal, it's also the systemic to Ibrahim Kendi's work. Like, again, I'm in the field of education, Black kid does something, white kid does something. And after they do the same thing, Black kids are 5 times more likely to be removed from school and to be suspended. In every industry you go to, whether it be healthcare or whatever, these are people like Dr. Jack was saying, who have good intentions, who work in the same system. So where's Islamic response to that? Like, it's not only an interpersonal, like, okay, you called me out of my name, you referred to me as something Black, and I mean that is a part of it. But right now, like, I think in the post-colonial moment or current colonial moment, depending on who you ask, many folks would kind of like have to move. It would be required, because these things like whiteness is normalized. I could use many examples from education, because that's what I know. Black girls come into school talking a particular way that they talk in their churches and their communities and their homes, but they're described as loud when they get to school, because there's an invisibilized marker that's not stated. It's an unstated marker of a particular noise level that's suited for white girls in school. And so you have all of these kind of like new forms of anti-Blackness that I think, but I don't know, Dr. Jack Brown is far more capable of speaking about it, but I think that our Islamic tradition does speak to all of these other types of, but I unfortunately, I think that there's just a deep ignorance, and it really hurts as a Muslim. I'll say this and I'll stop talking. I talk to superintendents across the United States. I've done, education project, and white folks in general will come in the room, they'll talk why their data looks a particular way, why students of color, communities of color, not just Black, but indigenous, whatever, don't feel comfortable. You try to have a basic level conversation, the same type of questions with Muslims, and they immediately go into a space of denial, immediately. So I don't know the path forward. I really don't know how to begin to move forward beyond where we are. I do think we're a bit stuck in the current Muslims community, unfortunately.
Could I'd like to
Please.
follow that by saying that this notion, the example that you use, the Black kids being more expressive. I think a couple of psychologists, the Psychology of Black Expressiveness, wrote about this years ago. And I think there's something to it. It's absolutely true that, quote, African-American culture is more expressive. However, I mean, the African-American milieu that I grew up in was very expressive. I went to a Black church, I was raised Baptist and all of that, but had a sense of decorum that was not about imitating white people, right? It was about how do we present ourselves to our Black community, because we were segregated at the time, and how do we move our race forward. And so I just want to just push back a little bit, Dr. Khalifa. We have to be more nuanced about when we talk about these things, because things, to me, changed dramatically after the 60s, for instance, about what Black culture is.
Jazakumullah khair. Thank you for that clarification. What I meant to say was that, so like federal researchers, both in the U.S. Department of Education and the Office of Civil Rights, follow why kids are suspended for school. And I was referring to, regardless, I'm not just talking about noise decorum, but anything that African-American kids do in school, Latino kids in school, and white kids do in school. So researchers follow that. And what they find is that even when the behaviors are exactly the same, people are treated differently. I mean, there's a very famous Yale child study that happened just a few years ago, in which they took these teachers and they said, okay, watch for the bad behaviors of these kids in the classroom. They have Black, Latino, and white kids in the classroom, and all of the eyes of the pre-service educators and the current educators were following Black boys around the room. Like, they had never seen these kids before. These were babies. They were 2 and 3 years old. So I guess the broader point I was making was not to kind of like slam Black culture. I mean, I'm very proud of it, but rather to say that there is an invisibilized norm that is deleterious and is dismissive and is marginalizing toward Black ways of being that you speak of in current schools. And that Muslims don't seem to have really a handle on any of that, and don't seem to, yeah.
Barakallahu feekum, jazakumullah khair. I'm a little conscious of time. I do want to maybe highlight the second poll that it asked, to what extent does anti-Blackness need to be addressed before Ummatics solidarity can be realized? It's a very interesting series of responses, because 2/3 say it is the top priority, or it is a top priority, whereas 20% or so says it needs to be addressed, but need not prevent the pursuit of ummatic goals while it remains unresolved. I mean, so actually, most people say that we actually do need to prioritize anti-Blackness as a core goal. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to do something really rude, which is I'm going to leave because I have to go. Because otherwise, Jimmy Jones is going to be upset. Because
yes, I will.
to see Jimmy Jones. So but I'm going to like literally just sign off, and then I don't know what you guys are going to do after that. I really apologize. I'm so sorry. I'm so rude. Forgive me. I'll buy you all lunch. Not people in the participants, but people on the panel. So I would say that like part of the problem is it's not about when you think about those school situations, it's all about, there's differences in cultures, right? So I could go to Egypt and I could be talking really quietly and people would say, you need to talk louder, right? Or something like that. So there's different cultures, and it's understandable that if you're in a cultural milieu, you adopt to that urf. That's what Muslims should. They respect urf, because urf, custom, is a big way of of how we interact with one another and how we have norms. That's fine. the problem is that in America, like the background is always that the white, quote unquote, white orf is the ruling one, and everybody has to adopt to that. Think about Italians, right? So an Italian comes in and talks really loud. They're also going to be, because there's going to be an othering, but what happens with people who become white is that they were allowed to, once they start acting like white people, quote unquote, they're accepted. Black people are never accepted. They're always the other, right? So that's why like Afro-pessimist ideas exist. It's like there's just nothing you can do. If you're black, you could act like Urkel, right? And you're still, people are just going to be waiting for you to do to commit a crime, right? Or to do something bad. So I think the big problem, even in Muslim communities, is not necessarily that there's anti-blackness, is that we've all adopted, because we're part of the modern world, we all accept white supremacy as a culture and as a aesthetic and everything, right? So successful Desis and Arabs in America, how do they act? They act like suburban white people. Their kids are whiter than I am, you know? They wear like, you know, I don't even know, like they're, you know, so my point is that they're like, that's the problem isn't how we view Black Muslims. It's that the pole star, like our Mecca, astaghfirullah, is always the ideal of whiteness, whether it's like being good Muslims when it comes to the government and you know, not having political opinions, or being good Muslims about how we dress and in Americanizing, like until I think that's the problem, because if we just continue to reinforce the idea of kind of white norms as the elite, we don't allow a culture to emerge that has like an elite culture that is actually diverse. Like
but let me ask you this: is the Arab and Desi hogging of public Muslim space in America, is that how is that related to what I mean
because they're people who made it because they're like engineers and lawyers and they work for Google or whatever and things like that, and they have a lot of money. They have more money than I do.
No, Jack, I know you have to leave, but leave that statement that Daisy are whiter than you. You leave that in Virginia. Don't bring it to DFW.
Okay, guys, I'll see you. So thanks so much for doing this. I appreciate everybody. Sorry I have to go.
No problem. Jazakumullah khairan, Professor Jonathan Brown, for really a wonderful sort of contribution. I would like to leave this to your discretion, Dr. Khalifa, Dr. Jones, in the sense that there are some questions still. If you have the time, another 10 minutes or so, I'm happy for us to sort of address some of those. And if you wanted to respond specifically to some of the comments that Jack made.
Dr. Khalifa is available. I am too.
I would love to stand with you on here, my brother, with you.
I mean, usually we do go about 2 hours, so we're coming up to that time. But I think this is such an important and valuable topic, and I'm sure that after having read sort of Jack's book, you have a lot to reflect on. I mean, I wanted to sort of ask something on the tail end of the comments that you were making. And, you know, one of the points that some of the literature on race now highlights is when we're talking about whiteness, we're not talking about phenotype. We're not talking about people's skin color. It is a sort of, you could say, a civilizational attitude that comes out of Europe. And I think it's in that spirit that Jack was making those last comments. And it's in that spirit that, Professor Khalifa, your remarks seem to be sort of directed as well, that in order for Muslims in North America, and this will be true in other places as well, but in order for Muslims in North America to make it, they basically have to assimilate to a culture which embodies that kind of anti-Black racism in very subtle ways, which, as Professor Jones sort of highlights, you know, perhaps as a counterpoint to what I've just said, that actually the 1960s and that, you know, that moment of transition was significant enough for us to now disaggregate the notion of white supremacy from US culture, you know, as a necessary relationship. And I feel that Muslims, particularly immigrant Muslims in the United States, have a way to go before they, you know, recognize the significant advantage that they have accrued by associating with the establishment, and in the ways that Professor Brown commented. So I don't know if you want to add anything to this, because I really would love to learn from you in this regard. And we, of course, also have some questions that are being articulated in the chat and the Q&A, which I would love to have your thoughts on.
I'll yield to you, Dr. Jones, but I will say that this has been an impediment for true solidarity, actually. How can you expect to withhold aspects of brotherhood or community solidarity, and for someone else to be to deliver their full, like ahuwa, their full rights? And so it is something that it's been very surface level. I think the conversations that have happened in the Muslim community, but I think we can't ignore too how many of the younger folks, like I'm a professor at Ohio State, and on college campus, a lot of young Muslims are like very, very fervently against white supremacy, but are not really willing to take up what immigrant supremacy, looks like in a public Muslim space, like in an MSA or like in a mosque or an Islamic organization. And I think that that's also seen as disingenuous. So like my wife is from East Africa, and East Africans, who are many are as dark as me, themselves have a term for people like me that they use among themselves, but in the non-Muslim public space, they're very in solidarity with Blackness, because that's the current currency in the moment now. But in like their own masajid spaces, this term is used quite frequently. But
East Africans, you're talking about East Africans of Indian heritage specifically?
No, I'm talking about of African heritage. So which is even more complex.
So what I'd say about this is that the classroom and the street are different. I actually got into higher education because I didn't want to be enveloped by the street, as it were. I was when I first started working as the executive director of the Black Coalition of Greater New Haven, our mantra was the freedom of Black people is responsibility of Black people. I think Dr. Khalifa is saying the same thing. But my point about this is that you really, it's one thing to talk about it. Again, in the classroom, everything is up for grabs, right? You talk about anything. But when I'm trying to, as Dr. Khalifa said, dismantle immigrant supremacy, I need to act. And I need to develop models of acting that, to me, need 2 points. One is consciousness raising about what it is. And again, how we name it is very important, right? And 2, strategies for dismantling it. And this is hard, tedious work, but it needs to be done.
I mean, I should just clarify for sort of audience members who are maybe attending from Europe, where the immigrant Muslims are the underclass, right? So in a sense, there is no equivalent to the indigenous underclass that the African-American Muslim community reflects or represents. I also
when I went to London, I was shocked that Pakistanis were the Black people of the educational system. I was shocked. The first time, years, a long time ago, first time I went, being a product of the 60s, and to see Pakistanis being talked about the exact same way Black people were, as the way Dr. Khalifa talked about, and being seen as sexual predators as well.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's quite sort of striking because, of course, South Asians are, in my experience at least, for 5 years in the US, remarkably successful in general. And it's a very different demographic that came to the UK. But unfortunately, in some respects, it continues to persist, that we continue to have those sorts of structural problems. I wanted to ask a question which sort of arose in the chat. But I seem to have lost it, unfortunately. I thought it was there. inshallah. There are some questions, and again, we are coming up to time, so I'm a bit conscious of that. But so this is from someone called Rabia Brown. Is it possible that the Muslims who seem to react with denial to talk of racism are from different ancestral and national origins, and are simply coming from a very different context respective to US-born Muslims? I don't know. Okay, a simple, straightforward question.
Go ahead, Dr. Yes, I would say yes, but we're not talking about in our questions, in our critique, we're not talking about the masses per se. We're talking about the Islamic leadership here who regularly take up their fiqh councils, their leadership councils. And Dr. Sherman Jackson wrote that book like almost 20 years ago, and other books have been written since, and it's really not gotten not gotten the discourse it needs to kind of be in the current moment. Like Dr. Jack Brown said, leadership, implications for masajid, for example. And two, very little, if any, action has happened because of it. There's some outliers like Iman in Chicago and other institutions. Yaqeen, I think, is an outlier, but we speak generally.
Yeah.
Just for people who are unfamiliar with the US context, we're speaking about Dr. Sherman Jackson's book, Islam and the Black American Towards the Third Resurrection, published by Oxford University Press. I want to say around 2004, but maybe a bit later than that. The question I
have to stick in here because
please.
Every few years, Abdul Hakim Sherman Jackson and I have this debate about the book. I think the book, as Dr. Khalifa points out, is very instructive to all of us, right, living in the United States, both what Dr. Jackson's called the Black Americans with the capital B, and the so-called immigrants. I think its major shortcoming, as far as I'm concerned, is that, and I wrote a brief piece about this in Islamic Horizon, from the back of the bus to the back of the camel. I love Sherman Jackson, really, I do. I just think that wasn't a useful framing, because if I'm immigrant, I mean, the camel jockey and all this kind of stuff, and we're not even talking about, we're talking mainly Daisy. It's just his framing and overall framing and the message to us and the message to people who are not Black Americans was a good one. But phrases like that, if I'm Daisy, I'm not Daisy, would feel might be a turnoff. Actually, we were in a conference with I think it was on Worthy Muhammad at Yale a few years back, and it was a conference where just about every segment of the Muslim community, or what I call the big A's, was represented. But I heard a complaint from younger Daisy people in particular about phraseology like that in the book. And this is my point about how you start conversations, that, if you're gonna start conversation like that, you got to work harder. So language is so very important as something that goes before action, and the kind of action that you want ought to be in language that is again intellectually provocative and inclusive. And I don't think terms like that are the intellectually provocative for sure, but inclusive not.
No, it's important food for thought, because these are fraught areas of discourse as well, and they need to be, we need to tread carefully to get the results that we really want, and inshallah we can sort of, in some respects, we have to be careful not to antagonize people who are our partners in this journey, inshallah. So I did want to highlight a comment from Huda Sharif, which is coming from a South Asian perspective, because my parents are from Bangladesh originally, so I'm South Asian, but I perhaps haven't highlighted this point, which is it would be surprising perhaps to white Europeans and Americans to realize that South Asians can actually be more racist and anti-Black. I mean, in fact, Huda is arguing that they are some of the most racist and anti-Black societies on the earth, which I think those are relative judgments. The argument here being made is that this may be rooted in the Hindu caste system. As someone who has lived for a period in Bangladesh and seen in at close quarters, particularly from the older generation, and sometimes people talk about the way in which you'll forgive a grandparent for making these kind of racist remarks, but I've heard members of that generation basically saying that Muslims should never marry people of African descent, even if they're Muslim, right? And these might be learned religious people, because they just cannot countenance in their minds that such people could be people we can marry. And I'm sure that this is a conversation I had in Bangladesh. I'm sure that sort of conversation is something which has been transported to the New World and, of course, to Europe as well by immigrants. So that's something that we need to be very conscious of. And that's precisely the point that Dr. Muhammad Khalifa, you were talking about earlier. There's another perhaps comment, and I don't know if you have access to the questions and comments, but if there are any in particular that you would like to highlight, please feel free to identify them. But perhaps I will do I'll read this as the last comment, potentially a question. I think it would be interesting. So this is from Asma al-Abid. I think it would be interesting to elaborate on racism as an act of rebellion against Allah in a similar vein to the way Iblis refused to bow to Adam because he believed himself to be made of better matter. Racism is at its core is to live according to your own imaginary hierarchical power structure that has real and harmful effects on different communities depending on the context you live in. If you internalize the American Sharia of white supremacy, it is shirk, which is kind of reflective of what Dr. Khalifa was saying earlier. Perhaps that's a good note on which to conclude our session. But Jazakumullah khairan to, of course, Jack, who's now absent. But
could I say one more thing before we close?
Please.
I think there are no women's voices here, and I think that has to be said, because this is a problem. And you find racism and sexism as twins often in these spaces. And I think, and there was an attempt to include a woman that she got sick, but also I was going to say this about the bibliography as well. I think if we're going to move forward, that how these two are intertwined has to be understood, and women's voices about these issues, the broader issue of anti-Blackness and racism and prejudice, have to be part of the conversation for obvious reasons. I'm sorry to bring this up so late, but I meant to in my first response, but didn't.
Absolutely. Jazakumullah khair for highlighting this. This is something, of course, we highlighted right at the beginning, which is very unfortunately our sole female panelist, Dr. Hadiza Kere Abdurrahman, was taken ill and wasn't able to join. We wish her a swift recovery, inshallah, complete recovery. But I think, Dr. Jones, you mentioned something which is of immense importance, which is particularly in the space of knowledge, the sort of marginality of female voices is something that should concern us all, and it needs to be, again, more than lip service needs to be paid to it. I'm talking about this. Talk is cheap. We need to really, in the institutions that we have, provide opportunities where female scholars can come and educate us, inshallah. And we pray to Allah that we are granted the tawfiq to do that as a community, as a whole, as institutions as well. It falls to me to thank you both, Jazakumullah khairan, Dr. Jones, Dr. Khalifa, for really an enlightening 2 hours of reflection, and of course to Jonathan Brown for writing the book that gave us the excuse to reflect collectively. With
Thank
that,
you so much. May Allah bless you for inviting me. Thank you, and Dr. Jones.
it's really an honor and a pleasure to have you both. And inshallah, we'll see you in future Ummatic sessions. We will be in touch, bi'idhnillah. But Jazakumullah khairan. And thank you finally to all the attendees who stuck with us for the full 2 hours. We still have 27 of you there. So Jazakumullah khairan. And we look forward to seeing you in roughly a month's time when we will be advertising another colloquium, still to be sort of confirmed. With that, I wish you all farewell. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik. أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
السلام ورحمة الله.